Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be zooming in from. My name is Brent Cotter. I'm the chair of the Speakers Committee at the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. I want to welcome you to this very special session that addresses some fascinating topics for us, both in the context of law, psychiatry, and history, essentially focusing on psychedelic psychiatrics and the way in which historically they have been considered. And we've got two outstanding presenters today, which will bring us into the context of both law and present circumstances dealing with these topics. Let me begin by acknowledging, as I do, that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Today, we are going to hear from Dr. Erika Dyck and from David Wood, a lawyer from Calgary. And I'm going to, at this moment, say a word just to thank the McKercher law firm, who are the sponsors of the speakers series that we are able to conduct at the College of Law. They've provided outstanding support historically and continue to do so. And it is with appreciation for them that we're able to bring this series to you, and particularly today's presentation. I'm now going to invite Cameron Christensen to introduce our two speakers today. Cameron?
Hello, everybody. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. So thank you again to McKercher, and thank you all for attending this event. I have the privilege of introducing our two panelists. To start off, we have Erika Dyck. Erika Dyck is a professor and a Canada Research Chair in the History of Health and Social Justice. Her interdisciplinary research brings social sciences and humanities perspective to specific and medical subjects. Her work published in medical legal, it has been published in medical, legal, economic, literary, philosophical, anthropological, and historical venues. She's the author of several books, including the Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, Facing Eugenics, Reproduction, Sterilization, and the Politics of Choice, which was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Canadian Nonfiction, Managing Madness, The Weyburn in Mental Hospital and the Transformation of Psychiatric Care in Canada, which won the Canadian Historical Association Prize for Best Book in Prairie History, and with Maureen Lux, Challenging Choices, Canada's Population Control in the 1970s. She is also the co-editor of Psychedelic Prophets, the Letters of Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, A Culture's Catalyst, Historical Encounters with the Native American Church and Canada and Peyote. Erika is also the co-editor of the Canadian Bulletin for Medical History / the Bulletin, or I won't read the French part of that. I don't think I'll butcher it. And the co-editor of a book series on the global history of alcohol and drugs called Intoxicating Histories, Psychedelic Plants, and the associate director of Chukroona Canada. And we also have David Wood. David is a lawyer and patent agent working at Saigen Industries. This is a contract manufacturer focused on providing active pharmaceutical ingredients in the research of chemicals for the use of clinical and non-clinical research of psychedelics. Saigen is focused on manufacturing both classical psychedelics such as LSD, psilocybin, DMT, MDMA, and manufacturing new chemical entities created by Saigen's customers. David also works with a small number of clients in the cannabis industry and in the psychedelic space through his solo legal practice, R Group Legal. David provides pro bono support to TherapSil, a nonprofit focused on expanding access to psilocybin for Canadians who can benefit from the therapeutic use of psilocybin. Prior to working at Saigen, David was a partner at an intellectual property group at a national law firm where he co-chaired a cannabis psychedelics focus groups alongside a partner practicing in capital markets. David is a University of Saskatchewan alumni where he completed a Bachelor of Science in 2000, his PhD in 2005, and obtained his LLP in 2008. Thank you all again for attending. I will now turn it over to Erika, who will start off the presentation.
Thanks so much, Cameron. I'm going to share my screen, or attempt to, and hopefully this will all work. And if it doesn't, someone will unmute themselves and tell me, I hope. Well, it's a real privilege to be here. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak with you all here today. I have been working on this topic for about 20 years, and I promised David that I would not squeeze out all of his time. So I'm going to try to do this efficiently. And David, you'll just come in and unmute yourself if I go on too long. So I just wanted to set this up a little bit. As Christian mentioned, Cameron mentioned, I'm a historian working on this topic, and I know some of you, I recognize some names here in the participants list. So you know that I've been working on this topic for a little bit now, but this topic has become really present as well. And I know that David is going to give us lots to think about in that domain. So I want to kind of start at the end in some respects, for me as a historian, at least thinking backwards. In August of 2020, Therapsil, which David's going to talk about, I presume, was granted an exemption through the Section 56 exemptions with Health Canada to provide psilocybin. And ironically or not, Saskatchewan had the first participant who legally took psilocybin in the 21st century, a fellow by the name of Thomas Hartle, who has been living with a palliative care diagnosis for the last 5 years. And I've had the great pleasure of working with Thomas and learning from him and interviewing him. Here he is in my living room as I set off on a voyage that is in part inspired by the resurgence of interest in psychedelic research, but also it is my journey as a historian trying to figure out what historical stories, reputations, and even pieces of discrimination have continued to shape the way we understand psychedelics in the current landscape. So these are a few examples. If anyone follows me on Twitter, I tried to tweet an exciting moment on a psychedelic road trip I took recently. I was interviewed by CBC. They asked me directly whether that included taking psychedelics every day. So I will tell you what I told CBC, which is follow me on Twitter. No, just kidding. I did not take psychedelics every day, but I did meet some really incredible people. There are a few examples here. Some of you may recognize some of these people, and probably some will not be recognizable. People like Rick Doblin in the top left is the executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. It is probably the largest not-for-profit organization invested in psychedelic science in the 21st century. Some of you may recognize Jerry Garcia and Janis Joplin. See if you can pick out which ones are Winona Ryder's parents. Jerry Garcia's wife is in there. There's some really exciting people who we met along the way as I drove to Vancouver and then took a plane to meet COVID restrictions and then drove to San Francisco, meeting with a number of people who I see as sometimes unsung heroes, not always the case with people like Rick Doblin, but other people who have been participating in some of the underground work, but also in some of the efforts to document the ways in which the past psychedelic excitement or enthusiasm for psychedelic science has continued to shape the reception today. So I will skip along from there, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. But of course, I had to bring up this image where I actually got to meet David. So though we cannot be there together today, this is just some photographic proof that we have in fact met each other at least once. And this was in Calgary, where he graciously agreed to do an interview with me as well to talk about the work that he's going to share with you today. So this was a really exciting road trip that I went on. Anyway, that road trip is going to kind of filter into this presentation in a few different ways. When I started doing this research as a PhD student in the early 2000s, though, what really where I focused my attention was on an earlier generation of research using psychedelics, or even before the word psychedelic was coined, hallucinogens and some of these other psychoactive substances, mostly LSD, some peyote or mescaline, and later a little bit of psilocybin. Those were the three psychoactive substances that really got a lot of the attention in the 1950s research. This image from 1961, this is from a Toronto Star Weekly, sort of helps us to anchor ourselves in that moment, perhaps. There's a space race going on, but also this notion that LSD was still sort of hanging in the balance of scientific justice at the time, wondering whether or not LSD would in fact become a miracle drug, or whether it would be unleashed as a menace. And, hindsight really helps us with our analysis here. But I want to sort of take us back into that moment, that this place where the menace was not yet unleashed or not yet described, and where LSD still held some fascination as a miracle drug. I'll very quickly touch on a few things here. LSD was first synthesized in 1938, but it was not first experienced until April 1943 by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. This is a graphic novel depiction of Albert Hofmann's LSD experience, where it's kind of been put into It's described as the bicycle trip. You may see, if you're part of psychedelic societies, people celebrating Bicycle Day on April 20th to commemorate when Albert Hofmann first had his experience with LSD when some spilled on his hand. The next day, he took some deliberately, got on his bike, and felt that he had plunged into a Salvador Dali painting. He experienced these vivid perceptual changes and wondered whether this could be of any benefit both to the scientific community, to the pharmaceutical house that he was working at, Sandoz, and whether psychiatrists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, and even neuroscientists might make use of this for understanding new ways of approaching consciousness studies. One person who later became famous within the psychedelic field, Stanislav Grof, who's pictured here in a couple of different images, felt that Dr. Hofmann's discovery of LSD generated a powerful wave of interest in brain chemistry. And together with the contemporaneous, I'll say, development of tranquilizers was directly responsible for what has been called the golden age of psychopharmacology. So as a historian, it's my job to sort of contextualize these moments. So LSD enters the scene in the 1940s, but it really isn't taken up by researchers with much intensity until the 1950s, alongside a whole host of other kinds of psychopharmacological substances. People other than Stanislav Grof have also described this period as initiating a psychopharmacological revolution. Now, typically, when psychopharmacologists and historians and sociologists write about this period, they're talking about antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, tranquilizers, a whole host of substances that later we see as typical or those that do well in randomized controlled trials. But in this moment, prior to the introduction of randomized controlled trials, there are also a number of other psychoactive substances that are being experimented with or examined. And that's the part that I want to sort of dig into here for a moment. If we look through medical publications at this time, there's also a real synergy with the rise of pharmaceutical advertising, and this is not a coincidence. We see going from hundreds of ads to thousands and then millions of ads going into a whole variety of different linguistic categories, but really direct advertising for these daily use pharmaceuticals that come in with a real sort of intensity in the 1950s. In fact, one psychopharmacologist / historian, David Healy, has argued that there were more psychoactive substances introduced in the 1950s than ever before or since. He argues, in fact, that it's that first generation of psychopharmaceuticals that has really dramatically changed the way we think about mental health research and medical research more broadly. So I'm going to use some Saskatchewan content here, but it is not just because I am speaking to you from my home in Saskatoon or because I am a proud member of the University of Saskatchewan Faculty Association or something like that. There is a real, I think, genuine argument to be made for why Saskatchewan deserves to be part of this story. Part of it relates to the election of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in 1944, which many of you sitting in this room or in your own rooms elsewhere will know was the party that brought publicly funded healthcare or Medicare to Canada. And we won't debate all the machinations of that set of policies, but importantly, running on an election based on healthcare reforms meant that Saskatchewan became something of an ideological magnet. Tommy Douglas, both as health minister and premier in the first term, became a real sort of lightning rod figure for attracting people back to the province or bringing in new professionals who would invest in a kind of healthcare, a set of healthcare reforms that was not only propped up by good scientific evidence, but that made good fiscal sense for a party bent on creating a publicly funded healthcare system. In this moment, and by the early 1950s, Douglas begins to recruit people directly from other places to fill important, sort of vital research positions and administrative positions within the healthcare system. And this is, I believe, why psychedelics came to Saskatchewan. In 1951, he hired the fellow sort of second from your left. He's holding some red thing. I think it's a camera, actually. Sorry, I'm getting told that I need to update my system. Hopefully it will let me get through the presentation. This is Dr. Humphrey Osmond. He trained, thanks, David. He was trained in the UK. He worked at the Maudsley Hospital before coming to Saskatchewan, and within a few months became the superintendent of the Weyburn Mental Hospital, or its official name, Saskatchewan Mental Hospital at Weyburn. At the time, the mental hospital there was described as the largest one in the British Commonwealth. and it was very overcrowded. Osmond came there already with an interest in hallucinations and hallucinogens, so psychoactive substances that cause hallucinations. And he became interested not only in developing research areas. Sorry, let me try that again. There were two arms to his research. One was to take hallucinogens, so this is before the word psychedelics is coined, to produce a model psychosis. So to that end, and I know there are some of you in the law faculty who at least know people who may have been volunteers in some of these early experiments. And I won't out anyone here today, but you're welcome to volunteer to come and do an interview with me later if you like. Some people would take these substances in order to appreciate what psychosis was like. Social workers, psychiatric nurses, psychologists, a few students, later a lot of students, would come to take these psychoactive substances and then write about them or describe them. And they compared these with descriptions, what they described as frank descriptions from psychotic patients or patients with schizophrenia, who at that time were the largest percentage of disordered category in the mental hospital. This is not exclusive to Saskatchewan, but the psychedelic component, the hallucinogen component is. The other one is for treatment for addictions. And here again, they use this idea that you could bring someone outside of themselves. You could give them an experience that was undescribable or difficult to describe in order to get them to see themselves differently. And I won't go into great detail about the addictions research right now, but I'm happy to explore that in the questions. I just want to sort of be efficient in my speaking here. Again, from a graphic novel that's coming out in November, Sidney Katz, a reporter from Toronto from Maclean's magazine, came to Weyburn in 1953, which is really early within the psychedelic research scene. He comes to Saskatchewan to do this sort of English language expose on what it's like to take psychedelics and what it means both for psychiatry, but also for transforming healthcare systems, of course. And he describes this kind of, again, undescribable thing, a place where we lose language. We are limited by our language in terms of describing the kinds of experiences that one has while taking these. And I will just, in case anyone's worried, these were all macro doses, large doses of LSD. And this research gained the attention of a variety of people, not just in Canada, but also British expat Aldous Huxley, who was then living in Beverly Hills, California. He reached out to Humphrey Osmond in 1953 and invited him to bring him some mescaline. And Osmond describes how he sort of cautiously, he drove to California to bring mescaline across the border at that time to give Aldous Huxley mescaline. And this, of course, inspires Huxley to write The Doors of Perception, which he did in less than a month after having his first mescaline experience. And it's this relationship that brings us the word psychedelic. So for anyone who really loves the archival details, here's my archival find. I think this was pretty fun to find. On the left-hand side, you'll see Aldous Huxley's typed, as his wife Maria actually typed it, and he's scribbled onto it, you know, this word that he's suggesting we should use, phanerothym or phanerothymic. And you can see down at the bottom, he says, to make this trivial world sublime, take 0.5 gram of phanerothym. And Osmond, upon receiving this letter, already you can sort of tell the difference in their writing. He says at the bottom, to plumb the depths or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And later he writes it, he changes it a little bit to fathom hell or go angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And if you Google these phrases, you'll see a variety of additional variations on these rhyming couplets. But this idea of introducing psychedelic to capture that indescribable experience was their gift in some respects. And it wasn't just for fun, although they were having fun here, I think. They also wanted a word that didn't necessarily tip the scales towards the psychopharmacologists, towards the psychiatrists, the psychoanalysts, or even of different philosophical traditions. They wanted a word that was somewhat untethered from those other traditions or those other ways of thinking, as a way of sort of breathing a kind of optimism into the language itself that would inspire continued research that could also be infused by these different kinds of threads or ways of knowing. So Osmond goes on to treat a number of people, mostly alcoholics, again, using both the model psychosis, but also using this idea that somehow these experiences would help people to get outside of themselves. Some people described it as collapsing 10 years of psychotherapy into an 8-hour session. And these were really vivid experiences. They had quite amazing results. Well, one of the things they very quickly recognized was that the results were optimized or improved upon when they paid attention to their surroundings. So psychedelic researchers today will describe the kind of set and setting, a language that is often associated with Timothy Leary, but a number of people, including the fellows depicted here in the cartoon, Abram Hoffer, who was a Saskatoon-based researcher, Duncan Blewett, who was a psychology professor at the University of Regina, and there are a number of others who could be featured here. They began to start thinking about how the environment affects outcomes in medical experimentation. So a few of the features here described or depicted rather, fresh cut flowers, music, a comfortable couch. You can't maybe tell from this image, but they always wanted to have a bathroom that was close by and accessible. All of these sorts of features which they felt helped people to feel good in those experiences. And here we have experience and experiment kind of overlapping in some respects. Now this model, a nice couch, flowers, music, differs dramatically from what is happening elsewhere in terms of psychopharmacological or pharmacological research more broadly. So that of, reducing the effects of the environment or reducing those confounding features so that we can understand efficacy and risk assessments in a different way. How am I doing for time? I'll try to go quickly. If you're interested, there are other people now revisiting this past the set and setting components to understand how that has been understood historically, but also how it did or didn't fit into the rising RCT methodology. So with those set and setting pieces in place, the results were quite amazing. They claimed 30 to 90% success rates. That is no more drinking in the cases of alcohol. Swift Current had one of the highest rates of 90% in a series of 3 trials, and that was with 2-year follow-up studies. These are pretty astounding, given that the contemporary results were about 30%, given any other kinds of options. 90% was overwhelming, and of course, drew a lot of attention, some of it which was critical. I want to keep kind of moving at pace here though. And also I would be remiss if I didn't bring out Roger Carter's involvement in this as a former member of your department. And I don't know if Mark is on the call or not, but perhaps Mark can let me know what he thinks of his father's involvement. But I wanted to, those sort of threads of knowledge that I was describing coming from sort of Western scientific perspectives was not the only thread that was inspiring some of the research that was done in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan had one of the only registered as a charity, the Native American Church of Canada, which is an organization that was described as a pan-Indigenous religion, which had sacred access to the peyote cactus as part of its healing ceremonies. Now, this was described both in spiritual terms and in healing terms, but there was pressure from the federal government in pending changes to the Indian Act in 1961, which Roger Carter writes about quite a bit in this particular case, where the Canadian government was going to change the access to peyote. They argued that the Native American Church was imported. It was not authentically Canadian. It was not authentically sort of belonging to the Indigenous knowledge keepers in Canada, and therefore it did not fit. Peyote was going to become illegal. As a result, in 1956, a number of different organizations got together, hosted by the Red Pheasant Reserve just outside of North Battleford, and they gathered and invited 4 what they described as white men, including Humphrey Osmond, Duncan Blewett, Abe Hoffer, and another psychologist named Teddy Wekowitz, to participate in the ceremony and to write about it. They hired Roger Carter partway through, sort of following the ceremony, to come up with some of the legal language to push back against the federal government's desire to sort of stamp out access to peyote. But one of the other effects was that participating in a ceremonial context in taking psychedelics, again, it was called hallucinogens at the time, 1956, participating in this ceremonial context also helped the researchers appreciate what ceremony and what context did to understanding the effects of psychedelics in those moments. So listening to drums, preparing, integrating the insights from the ceremony into a session. All of these started to inspire them to think about how that could be grafted into a psychotherapeutic encounter as well. There's just a couple of pictures. The Star Phoenix has a wonderful collection of photos from this particular ceremony, which took place in October 1956. All right, so I'm going to get close to transitioning over to David now. So in Saskatchewan, at least, there seemed to be a sort of coalition of interests here. And some of these were strange allies. You have Tommy Douglas supporting this. I have not yet found evidence that he ever took psychedelics, but he certainly supported and paid for a number of psychedelic researchers to continue and really to sustain their research. There are a number of religious figures who become supportive of this research and also participated in it themselves. There are examples of a number of religious leaders who come seeking a psychedelic experience to understand whether or not there's a spiritual root or a spiritual kind of experience that can be part of it. Temperance organizations, even Alcoholics Anonymous, including the co-founder Bill Wilson or Bill W., supported psychedelic research for addictions research. And I'm going to not belabor this too much. So what happens? I mean, now I'm telling you all the exciting historical parts, but we know that psychedelics, at least for now, unless David tells us differently, are still illegal. So what happened? I think one of the big answers is the public trust in science was shattered by a number of different events and issues that started to challenge our understandings of whether or not the government, in combination with the scientific and medical community, whether or not they've effectively created the methodologies that reduce risk, whether they've satisfied us that they've reached safety protocols. Thalidomide is a great example, but we can also think of others. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is also published in 1962 and reminds us that the oceans are in fact full of toxic waste. This kind of shaking of confidence is, we can see this represented specifically in parliamentary debates. In 1962, the health minister says, that's it, no more psychedelic research. We're going to put this on a new schedule, Schedule H, where more research needs to be done before we can continue to let to have direct medical access to psychedelics. At this point, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the Canadian Psychology Association banded together and said, no, it's the professional prerogative of the sort of larger medical communities to determine whether or not we meet sufficient safety and risk profiles. And again, if those of you are interested, there's Pierre Burton talking to Abe Hoffer and some University of Toronto students there on a televised event. But around the same time that there are, I think, legitimate questions about, scientific efficacy and scientific experimentation, other things are happening that are changing the narrative or changing the script. Timothy Leary, PhD from Harvard psychologist, is removed from his position. Depends which biography you read as to what the results were or why that was. Rather, my favorite is that he was sleeping with not his wife and also probably his students in California while he was supposed to be lecturing in Boston or Cambridge. So that's my favorite version of the reason. The point is, Leary sort of gets catapulted into the media as a new way of embodying a psychedelic ethos, not one that is tethered to scientific or professional discourse, but one that may inspire a countercultural revolution by tuning in and dropping out. Reject authority, reject science, reject these infrastructures, reject the law, and take matters into your own hands by going on your own voyage and inspiring others to do so by taking psychedelics. Leary's dismissal from Harvard and catapulting into the public spotlight coincides also with a rise in recognition of a black market in acid and blotter acid. So acid being sold on paper, the RCMP is really frustrated with this because it's really hard to detect it. And I'm sure it's not just the RCMP. Canada is also facing this, and here at the University of Saskatchewan, some of the researchers who had been some of the most qualified and sort of well-known for doing psychedelic research were quite frustrated that some of their student volunteers were no longer naive drug users, but were coming with their own musical selections. Can you believe it? They brought their own records into that room rather than listening to Beethoven or rather than listening to Bach. They were listening to the Grateful Dead. And this was confounding expectations because they felt that people were coming in expecting to have a nice experience, and they weren't really giving them qualified information in those medical experiments. Again, I'm not making this up. It's just, the story has so much to do with Saskatchewan. John G. Diefenbaker, who is, buried a few hundred yards from where some of you might be sitting, he's really outraged by the way, he's the leader of the opposition at this time, he's quite outraged by the way that the federal government is not stepping in more quickly and more directly in stamping out some of this research. And he stands up in Parliament and calls out the Senate, asking them to make a more specific and aggressive pronouncement. The Senate responds, and Senator Molson, of course, of the brewing company, does argue that these drugs, and now they've added a number of other substances that are part of the psychedelic family. Senator Molson introduces this bill where research is now squeezed through the health minister. All research using psychedelics has to go through Minister Alan McKercher, and within another year, the World Health Organization argues that these drugs are now dangerous and should not be used for medical research anymore. I promise I'm almost to you, David. Until recently, and I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, this has been changing. In 2007, psychopharmacologist in Britain, David Nutt, pictured here, argued that we've been wrong in how we assess risk and how we assess danger. So again, sort of teasing apart those political and scientific and methodological questions, he argues that if we take into account the effects and the expense in our healthcare systems, we need to rearrange what we think of as being dangerous or harmful in our drug assessment scales. He would also say that riding a horse is dangerous. This made people upset, but he nonetheless, he has now become a very important speaker, arguing that the labyrinthian designs of our pharmaceutical research and pharmaceutical regulations have changed and sometimes confused the way we think about risk, and that we need to rethink risk. And he sees psychedelics as a way of testing some of these new profiles. Many people are claiming that there's a psychedelic renaissance. Ben Sessa, pictured here, is the one who actually coined the word, but there are a number of research units. And if we look across Canada, there are now a number of psychedelic research chairs being formed across Canada as well. So is Canada ready to legalize psychedelics? Is Health Canada going to make this change, or Justice Canada? I'm going to turn it over to David, and I will just put this up as my last slide. If anybody's interested, some of the materials that I described can be found in these publications, but I'm also happy to pass over the baton now. I will stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about Saigen briefly, and I've already been introduced. Really happy to be speaking to law students. Hope you enjoy what you're getting into. It can be a wonderful career, and if there's an opportunity, maybe I can speak with some of you after if you have any more specific questions. To start off with, again, briefly, I'm a lawyer and patent agent. I practiced for 12 years in patent law, and included in that 12 years is about 5 years in cannabis and controlled substance regulatory law, starting in 2016. And in May of 2021, I joined Saigen as their general counsel and chief legal officer. And I have not had the privilege of having psychedelics be a focus of my career as long as Erika has, but I can say it's tremendously rewarding to be working in this space now. And had it been a possibility when I first graduated with my BSc in 2000, or my PhD in 2005, or my law degree in 2008, I certainly would have leapt into it. And I've already taken calls with a couple law students who found me asking how to participate in this space. And it certainly is an exciting one. So I'll just start out by doing something a lot of the law students will be doing when they give advice or not advice, when they give presentations in the future, and just make it clear that nothing I'm about to say is legal advice. Please do not try to source controlled substances. And please understand that while I disagree that they're illegal, they're not illegal. You're not allowed to have them unless you have authorization. So we'll get into that in a minute. But first, briefly, Saigen. So Saigen is a contract manufacturer. We're based in Calgary, Alberta, and we're currently waiting for a Health Canada dealer's license to issue. Unfortunately, the pandemic has frustrated some aspects of our lab build out, and we're, waiting patiently for that to finish. But from the review standpoint, everything looks great, and we're happy with our progress and happy with our interaction with Health Canada. Because as Erika pointed out, research on controlled substances in general now flows entirely through Health Canada, through the controlled drugs section of the Office of Controlled Substances, and in some cases through the Minister of Health directly. And that can really, that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but it is how it works. And waiting for these regulatory approvals is, something that's just a high pressure part of any business plan. But once Saigen is licensed, the 6 controlled substances shown in this diagram are the ones that we will be producing as active pharmaceutical ingredients. And we've seen significant demand for the first 4 and interest in the last 2. And so very briefly, the substances you see there are LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, DMT, mescaline, and 2CB. Each of which are in Schedule 3 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and each of which has some level of illicit market out there. Saigen's goal is to manufacture these substances in concordance with good manufacturing practices so that these substances can be sold consistent with the law to anyone who has the proper authorizations. And I'll give more context around that right now. So the law here, to start off with, psychedelics are not illegal. I would never use that word, illegal. Murder is illegal and treason is illegal. Psychedelics are controlled substances. And like any substance that is controlled in a specific way, regulated in a specific way, there are authorizations and prohibitions that apply to that substance. And I think if you want to kind of relate to what I'm trying to say here is, let's think about products that are easier to buy in a consumer packaged goods setting. In Canada, the obvious ones to me are cannabis products. This is a cannabis product. This had cannabis in it. It's labeled in a particular way, and you can buy it. But you're not allowed to sell these to people unless you hold the right authorizations. You could say all the same things about tobacco products. I don't have an example of those handy. But in either case, the substance cannot be dealt with commercially unless the person, and I'm using that word very broadly, person, including a company, is able to hold an authorization that allows them to manufacture, to sell, or to do whatever it is they're trying to do with that substance. So I really think it's important to think of controlled substances this way, because as soon as we characterize them as illegal, there's almost a morality that comes into it, almost a value judgment, and almost a presumption that there's something wrong with wanting to work with them. And there absolutely isn't. They're incredibly valuable. The massive preponderance of evidence suggests that they're extremely helpful in psychotherapy. And I mean, we knew this in the 1950s. I'm sure in some parts of the world, they knew it before that. And I'm very interested to see that graphic novel that Erika was mentioning, because I think it's very, very difficult for anyone kind of born after 1970 to understand that there was a time when LSD or psilocybin or DMT or mescaline, which I think were probably the best known in the 60s, especially LSD and mescaline, there was a time when there was no real cultural baggage attached to those. Like, I remember, I'm 43. So the first person I ever heard talk about drugs was Nancy Reagan. And she made me as terrified of drugs as I was of the Soviet Union. And the messaging, kind of always followed that. And it's just interesting to me to think about what a cultural context would have been like, where there is this this substance that could so profoundly alter your interaction with the world around you and your perception of it, your perception of yourself, or even the concept of yourself. And there was nothing criminal about it. There was nothing underground about it. It may have felt somewhat subversive, but it wasn't, there was nothing criminal there. And I will always wonder what those first experiences for those people must have been like without that shadow of criminality, which if anyone on the call right now has ever used psychedelics, unless they were in Brazil, Jamaica, or the Netherlands, they probably did have that kind of feel of, what if I get caught? And in a state that makes one so vulnerable, particularly to one's own critique, it would have been very interesting to experience it without that. And perhaps that will, again, it's possible with this one. It might be possible with another. I wouldn't be surprised if Canada never regulates another controlled substance as a consumer packaged good like it did with cannabis. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they made things that looked a bit like this, but with psilocybin. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So most of the presentation will be on this slide. So, there's a lot to take in here. It's color coded, and it will help me walk through with all of you how the prohibitions and the authorizations around controlled substances actually play out under Canadian law. So 1961, Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs came into effect. Canada's a signatory. Canada put into effect what's called the Narcotic Control Act in the 1960s for compliance with our international duties under the Single Convention. And just for brief legal context, a treaty or a declaration or a convention isn't law. It's not the law in Canada or in any other country. My understanding is that the DPRK, North Korea, never actually signed on to the Single Convention. I'm not positive on that. I've never checked, but I have heard that. So, these controlled substance laws, it seems so ubiquitous in the world. It's only that way because everyone put into effect domestic law that made the treaty have effect in their jurisdiction. And for Canada, that was the Narcotic Control Act, replaced in 1996 by the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And we have the CDSA here. So you'll see that draws a giant box around the entire image. That's because the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act applies to 100% of activities in Canada that involve a controlled substance, like LSD, like mescaline, like any 2,5 substituted or 2,6 substituted phenethylamine. We have laws that control these substances, so they're called controlled substances. So within that prohibition, which is a blanket presumption, how does one work with a controlled substance? The simplest and most straightforward ways are the blue and purple boxes. And those come up a couple times, but let's look at them up here first. So we have a dealer's license. What is a dealer's license? It is a license to deal in the substance. And there are 3 types of regulations there's 4 types of regulations that dealer's licenses can be issued under. The Narcotic Control Regulations, Food and Drug Part G, which regulates controlled drugs, Food and Drug Regulations Part J, which regulates restricted drugs. I didn't include it here, but also the benzodiazepines and other targeted substances regulations, which control benzodiazepines and other targeted substances. So for a few quick examples, narcotics are mostly true to the actual meaning of the word, which is sleep-inducing. Narcotics predominantly are opiates. Then there's a few others that maybe aren't sleep-inducing, like cocaine, which is also a narcotic in Canada. Ketamine is a narcotic. Those PCP is a narcotic. Those are kind of the best known examples. Part G of the Food and Drug Regulations has 3 broad categories: sedatives, stimulants, and anabolic steroids. Those are all controlled drugs. Many of them are prescribed. Methylphenidate, which is the active ingredient in Ritalin, or amphetamine, which is the active ingredient in Dexedrine or Adderall, those are controlled drugs. Part J is the one we're focusing on right now, which is the classical, well, not psychedelics in general are included in Part J. And Part J is actually subject to a higher level of regulation than Part G or than the narcotic control regulations, because narcotics and controlled drugs include examples of products that are available for purchase. That's why down here, this is the commercial stream with the green box around it. We'll get to that in a minute. You'll just see that it's NCR or FDRG, not FDRJ. So we have different kinds of controlled substances is the main point. Now the CDSA prohibits possession without authorization of all controlled substances, full stop. These regulations I just talked about are the regulations under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And yes, Part G and Part J of the Food and Drug Regulations are under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. It's a bit confusing. It's just how it is. Most of the Food and Drug Regulations are under the Food and Drugs Act. So once one has a dealer's license, then one can deal, that is possess, manufacture, sell, export, import, transport, and otherwise deal with a controlled substance. That's why there's a little arrow here. So a dealer, in the simplest context, can transfer material to an exemption holder. Exemptions are issued directly under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and they allow possession and whatever else is specifically outlined in the exemption. Exemptions can be very, very customized. And we'll talk about Therasil and exemptions and the, let's say, early version of medical possession to possess. I don't call it medical access because it isn't, to psilocybin. But again, we'll save that for last. So for someone to work with a controlled substance in a research setting, such as university, that person would need two things: an exemption that is given by Health Canada and an FDRJ authorization, which would be put on the same piece of paper as the exemption. But technically there are two authorizations provided. When the exemption is issued, then the dealer, who's over here, will receive notification that this new exemption holder is allowed to buy this much of this substance until this expiration date. And then typically uses our preclinical animal work, in vitro analytical work, and tissue culture work. Those would be standard reasons to get an exemption. There are a few other reasons, but those are the common ones. And then let's go a step further. Let's say that we're not just doing this in vitro work. Let's say we want to feed psychedelic drugs to humans. In that case, one would need, again, a dealer who can manufacture the material. And you'll see, pre-DIN. DIN means drug identification number. That means the product can be sold commercially under prescription, over the counter. That's unlikely for psychedelics, or hospital use only, like an anesthetic, right? But all of those would have a DIN, a drug identification number, which matches an active pharmaceutical ingredient with a dosage regimen with a therapeutic indication, as in X amount of aspirin. I don't know the active dose of acetaminophen, but X amount of acetaminophen for headaches being sold in a little box. That would be something that is, has a DIN and can be sold over the counter. So to do clinical research, you would still need an exemption, only this time the exemption would probably be at a clinic instead of at a university research lab. And the clinic would then administer the substance, which was manufactured in accordance with good manufacturing practices, not required up here where no humans taking it, but is required down here for clinical trials. These clinical trials, you'll see there's an orange box around this whole thing. These clinical trials must be approved by Health Canada, by the Therapeutic Products Directorate. They must be ethical, consistent with the Tri-Council policy statement and other kind of standards that we apply to clinical research. And they'd be then given to humans in a clinical trial, and the results would be observed. So upon conclusion of those clinical trials, then you would have to manufacture your drug product that has a DIN, post-DIN, at a place that has a dealer's license, because you're still dealing with a controlled substance, and also has a drug establishment license, which means Health Canada believes you when you say you can responsibly and reasonably make this stuff at scale. The drug establishment license has nothing to do with security or monitoring or controlling diversion. It's all to do with quality control. The dealer's license has to do with whether or not you can be trusted to possess and work with a controlled substance. And then how would these substances be used? Well, they could be used in a phase 4 clinical trial. We won't get into that much. I do have limited time. It's kind of secondary for this overview. But more importantly, it can be transferred for commercial sale to a pharmacy, to a healthcare practitioner, a hospital, or to the Minister of Health. Now, I've marked this as purple because in addition to being governed under the Narcotic Control Regulations, or Food and Drug Part G, which the outline says here, it's blue, which means that, there's certain rules about controlled drugs and narcotics. If a pharmacist is reported for diverting them or, fulfilling prescriptions they shouldn't, then they lose the ability to actually provide those drugs. Like, that is a system, and potentially their license if it's serious enough. But provincial healthcare legislation governs the rules under which each of these in a particular province can, except the Minister of Health, can provide these substances to people. Other than this provincial healthcare legislation, all of this legislation is federal, which means the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act applies uniformly across Canada. That's why you can't have one province having legal cannabis, but another. Although many, many, many Americans I talked to thought that British Columbia had legalized cannabis prior to the rest of Canada. That's not true. It's impossible, although it was de facto non-criminal, at least in Vancouver, just based on lack of enforcement. Because in the United States, it's inverted. Like, if you kind of think some states have death penalty, others don't, that's not possible in Canada. We got rid of our death penalty in 1962, and which I know because I worked at a corrections museum in Prince Albert the summer after I worked at John Diefenbaker House, to have a little point of connection to Erika's talk other than psychedelics. Very rewarding job, very interesting. But in Saskatchewan, in Canada, you cannot have different status of controlled substances in different provinces. And that's because the CDSA is uniform across the country. Some of you may have heard that Vancouver or Toronto, it's both now, want to remove penalties for possession of drugs in city limits. That would be through an exemption that would apply to the entire city. So those municipalities would have to ask Health Canada to issue the exemption. And if Health Canada fails to do that, then those municipalities would have to consider whether to have that decision reviewed. Perhaps because they'd be arguing that they're allowed to govern as they wish inside their limits. So that's the normal way psychedelics can be accessed: in a clinical trial or in an approved drug product. The first approved drug product, and while I wouldn't really technically call this a psychedelic, let's be easy, MDMA. Rick Doblin, the gentleman sitting next to Erika in the top left picture in her picture panel, he founded a charitable organization in 1986 called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And the drug development arm of MAPS, which is called MAPS Public Benefit Corp., is likely to hold a DIN, or the American equivalent of one, for MDMA very soon, I'd say in the next 2 years in the United States, for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is tremendous because right now we have people taking handfuls of Part G drugs, sedatives, and maybe stimulants and some unscheduled drugs that are antipsychotics, and taking them on a daily basis and basically ruining their lives with side effects. What the MAPS Public Benefit Corp phase 3 trial showed is that a majority of PTSD sufferers were symptom-free and prescription-free 6 months after taking MDMA on, it's either 2 or 3 occasions. I think it's 3 occasions in the middle of 6 weeks of psychotherapy. So, you know, if I think, no matter what my personal view on MDMA may or may not be, I would think that if someone close to me were affected by PTSD, I'd be much happier if they weren't taking a handful of other drugs just to keep the symptoms suppressed every day. So that's how psychedelics, and we'll see psilocybin drug products this decade, I'd say it's as a virtual certainty as well. And so that's pharmaceuticals. That's how you can commercialize psychedelics today with 0 changes in the law. Therasil is a nonprofit. Therasil's gotten access to, I believe it's just under 60 Canadians now for medical. Thomas Hartle was the first. He was among 4 exemptions that were issued on August 4th, 2020. He was also in a photo with Erika. And Therasil helped him get an exemption to possess and consume psilocybin. So he had one of these exemptions right here. But what he didn't have was a dealer. There was no one to sell psilocybin to him. He had to source it himself. Every exemption holder who's been given an authorization to possess and consume for either therapeutic purposes or for training purposes, a healthcare practitioner has been forced to source outside of any regulated channels. Now, they're not breaking the law when they do that if they receive it from somebody else. If they receive psilocybin from a third party, that third party is contravening the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act by possessing and transporting psilocybin, conveying it, trafficking it to the exemption holder. But the exemption holder is authorized to possess. So as soon as it's in their possession, there's no contravention of the act, which is strange. It's counterintuitive. It's a bit weird, but it comes from the fact that it is not a crime to buy a controlled substance. It's a crime to possess it, and it's a crime to attempt to possess it, but it is not a crime to buy it, if you see the distinction. So if you're authorized to possess and someone hands you something and you're authorized to possess that much of that thing, they used to be breaking the law. Now, no one is. So it's not an ideal system. And at Therasil, and at an organization called the Canadian Psychedelics Association, I believe it's being renamed, but because their acronym is CPA, which is a common acronym. But both of these organizations have submitted proposals to the federal government to regulate psilocybin and establish a supply chain, much like we do with these things, with cannabis products, because this product has an active ingredient and it has an amount of THC. I'm not going to try and hold that up, but it's right there. However, there's no therapeutic indication on here. There's a warning label, but there's no statement, and there can't be, about what this may or may not be good for. Sorry, I'm not sure if everyone can see me on camera. I'm holding up a cannabis container. But the point is, what would be nice is if Canada is going to allow people to use psilocybin outside of this framework of pharmaceuticals, that people have a way of accessing it medically from a regulated source, much like we've been doing with cannabis since 2001. So to date, the exemptions issued by Therasil and by one other company are under the CDSA, and possession and use are authorized, but there's no source defined for the psilocybin, for this stuff right here. So that's not ideal. And if we're going to continue to see these exemptions, and I really hope we do, because I think it's what's right for Canadians, especially, you know, with mental health issues being worse than prior to COVID and money being short to deal with them. I think it would be great if for everybody, if psilocybin were made available outside of the prescription drug system, much like cannabis. Details of that would be a different talk. that's about all I have to say. I really hope this was helpful. And if there's any questions, also, one of the substances shown here is not at all like the others. Someone can email me, tell me which one, and tell me why. I can't offer anything specific for that, but it would be a great way to get introduced.
Thank you to Erika and David. I believe we are just out of time. I don't want to make any offers that you guys don't want to have happen, but I believe both of you would be comfortable answering emails if there was other questions. I think that'd be appropriate too. I'll turn it over to Brent for the final words and one last thank you to McKercher.
Thank you very much, Erika and David, and to Cameron for moderating the presentation. A fascinating topic and a reminder of the way in which sort of the evolution of society on questions like this has been quite remarkable and interesting, and the way in which it's relevant to law students, to lawyers is a particularly interesting interconnection in the two presentations. So I want to extend my thanks to both of you for carving this time out of your work, David, and your sabbatical, Erika, for sharing it with us, a significant audience, and I hope all the audience participants enjoyed it as much as I did. I want to just close by thanking all of you, and to thank again the McKercher Law Firm for its support of our speaker series. This is the last of the sessions for this semester. We try to back off on the speakers series as we get closer to the exams, but we'll be having a series of very interesting presentations beginning in January, and I hope you will watch for the announcements of all of those and join us nearly always on Mondays at noon Saskatoon time for the speaker series to continue in the new year 2022. Again, thanks very much to our presenters today, and thanks to all of you for joining us. All the very best.